Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Michelle and I'm from North Carolina, where I was raised on a rather small farm in close proximity to a quaint, rather charming town. I grew up in my family home with my mother and father and my two younger sisters, Lola and Chloe. We lived in an old federal-style farmhouse on a few acres of land in an idyllic, very scenic part of the world, overlooking statuesque mountains, undulating green valleys, flowering meadows, ubiquitous trees, silvery lakes, and all manner of bedazzling scenic vistas. Growing up in the early 60s, my sisters and I adored riding our bicycles and visiting the old cemetery at the end of the precipitous, bumpy, uneven dirt road that was surrounded by acres of verdant turf and heavily flanked by vast areas of natural oak, pine and maple forest. For some reason we sought great enjoyment and pleasure in visiting the centuries-old graveyard and studying all the vintage antique gravestones. Sad to say that the old gravedigger who managed the grounds at the cemetery was a bad, grumpy, crotchety, cantankerous, ill-tempered man called Mr. Stevens, who despised and loathed children. There was something creepy and rather unpleasant about him, and my mother always wisely warned us to keep a safe distance away from him and not to let the man bully or intimidate us. "Why don't you kids leave the cemetery alone and go and hang out somewhere else," he said to us one day on one of our fleeting visits to the graveyard. "We like it here, Mr. Stevens," I told him defiantly, "and we have as much right to be here as you do. Besides, it's so beautiful here, and we enjoy looking at the gravestones, and we love the wood green." "Why can't you be like other little girls and go and play with your dollies?" "I'm 11 years old, Mr. Stevens. We're way too old to play with dolls." "Well, mind you keep out of my way," he said. "I have a grave to dig, and I don't need 3 rambunctious, boisterous kids gallivanting around the graveyard, causing all kinds of mayhem." "Who died, Mr. Stevens?" I asked, trying to make an effort to be friendly. "It's none of your business, little girl. Now get lost, will you?" "He's a horrible, crotchety, grumpy old man," I said loudly, hoping Mr. Stevens would hear me. "I heard that, young girl," snapped Mr. Stevens. "Watch yourself, little girl. You've got a mouth on you that wants shutting up, and if you're not careful, I'll do it for you." Ignoring Mr. Stevens' scathing remarks, we wilfully rode our bicycles down the smooth paved road of the cemetery to further afield, where the forgotten, abandoned old graves on site stood proudly like fallen heroes from an ancient time that were no longer remembered and were covered in moss, and even the dates and names were no longer discernible on the stones. We loved this particular part of the graveyard because it was so long-standing, historic and mysterious. "I don't think we should keep coming here," said Chloe. "I don't like Mr. Stevens. He's such a spiteful, old, mean man." Mum said we should never let grown-ups browbeat us into submission just because they're old. We need to stick up for our rights. "That man is a great big obnoxious bully," I said. "Michelle's right," agreed Lola. "We like coming here, and that nasty old codger can't stop us. Besides, I love it here. It's so peaceful and tranquil. It's lovely watching the cottontail rabbits hopping all over the grass and seeing the deer scampering everywhere. It's our special place to see birds and to go exploring. Why should Mr. Stevens ruin it all for us? After all, this land is accessible to everyone. He doesn't have an exclusive right to any of it." "Thanks, Lola," I said, giving my sister a grateful nudge. "I couldn't have put it better myself. This is indeed our quintessential unique place, even if it is a time-worn graveyard." I began to brush the moss away from one of the archaic-looking graves. "I wish we could see who this grave belongs to," I said. "It's really sad that all the writing has worn away and been eroded by time. It must be very old indeed. Mum says some of the graves are over 300 years old, or possibly older. I wonder what life was like back then." "Oh no," gasped Lola suddenly. "Look, Mr. Stevens is coming this way. I wonder what he wants. He looks as mad as hell." Lola was right. We could see Mr. Stevens marching towards us with a determined, speedy gait, and his countenance was exceedingly hostile. "Oh dear," I thought to myself, "what have we done now?" "You think that's funny, little girl," he said, looking at me with an infurious, indignant expression upon his face. "I know it was you, throwing all those pine cones at me a moment ago. I'm not amused, not in the slightest. Look at my face. Am I laughing? Of course I'm not, because it's not even remotely amusing. You're all trying my patience, and I'm at the end of my rope. You think I don't know what's going on? You're a nasty piece of work," he said, sneering at me. "I saw you all there, shadowing me behind that oak tree over there. I wasn't born yesterday, you know. If you've got nothing to do, go back home to play with your little dollies." "I never threw any pine cones at you, Mr. Stephen," I said defensively. "I don't like you, and I think you're mean, but I never threw anything at you. And besides, we weren't hiding behind an oak tree. We've been here all the time by this grave." "I'm watching you, young girl," said Mr. Stephen, wagging his finger wearily at me. "Why don't you kids go and get lost?" he said. "Even the dead don't want you hanging around, snooping around the gravestones like little ferrets. They must be turning in their graves at you lot running amuck all over the place." "We're going, Mr. Stevens," I said, "but not on your account. We have to get back for lunch." "Good riddance to you then," said Mr. Stevens, watching us ride out of the graveyards on our bikes, and he was shaking his head furiously. When we returned home, my mother was in the kitchen with Emma Stevens, who was, in fact, the gravedigger's daughter, and, ironically, my mother's dearest and very best friend. It would seem that there was no love lost between Emma and her father, for they were not even on speaking terms, and I never really knew why that was the case, but that was all about to change. I was about to learn some interesting, rather revealing facts about Mr. Stevens that would leave me feeling more than a little discomposed. "We saw your dad at the graveyard," I told her, as we all gathered together around the table eating lunch. "He was accusing us of throwing pine cones at him," said Chloe. "He's not a nice man." "Why do you think I haven't spoken to him in years?" said Emma. "My father is a despicable, insidious character, without a civilised, cultured or sensitive bone in that decrepit body of his. When I was your age, he bullied and belittled us all the time, and treated my abused mother like a caged animal. He even locked her up in her bedroom at times, just to teach her a lesson. I mean, what kind of a man treats his wife with so little regard? He was a misogynist who absolutely had no respect for women." "Where is your mother now?" I asked curiously. "I haven't seen her in town." "She's probably lying in one of those unmarked graves in the cemetery, or sharing a coffin with one of the dead corpses my father's buried," said Emma scathingly. At this my mother almost choked on the piece of quiche she was eating. "What are you talking about, Emma?" she said, looking aghast. "I thought you said your mother just abandoned you one day and absconded to Florida, leaving you both high and dry." "That's what my father wanted us to believe, and for years we believed his duplicitous lies," said Emma. "My sister Doris and I know without a shadow of a doubt that my mother would never have just run off to Florida without so much as a by or leave. Granted, she was abused by my father, but she loved the bones off the both of us. We knew she would never have left us alone in his charge. There was something suspicious about the whole case, but we only reflected on it when we were much older. Old enough to understand, that is." You never told me all this before, Emma, said my mother, looking appalled. What was the point, said Emma. It's like unearthing old wounds or picking at an old scab that never ever heals. I don't like to reflect over my miserable childhood, or how Doris and I would cry ourselves to sleep every night. We would block our ears to deaden the atrocious sound of my mother's frantic cries and perpetual sobbing as my father physically assaulted her, beating her black and blue with his studded leather belt. There were times my mother could barely walk, the pain was so excruciating. It wouldn't surprise me if one day things went too far in one of his heated moments of indignant rage. I wouldn't put anything past my father. Are you saying what I think you're saying, said my mother, staring at Emma with eyes as wide as saucers, as if she was seeing her for the very first time in her life. Well, think about it, said Emma, taking a big swig of wine from her glass. My sister and I never heard a dicky-bird from my mother in years. Doris and I hired a private detective to try and locate her, and he couldn't find a trace of her, not in the Florida area or anywhere else for that matter, as she left behind no paper trail behind her. It's like she just vanished off the face of this earth. You mark my words, my father is behind her disappearance. I'm certain of it. You think your mother is buried in our local cemetery? I asked. That's exactly what Doris and I believe, said Emma. My father's been managing and maintaining that graveyard for many years. He's been digging graveyards since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. It would be easy to dispose of my mother's remains without anyone raising a cynical eyebrow. All he needed to do was to stuff her in the coffin of one of the deceased bodies, and no one would be any the wiser, nor would they suspect a thing. My word, said my mother, gasping, you are right. I hadn't thought of that. It would be so easy for him to dispose of her like that. What a horrifying thought! You really believe he's capable of such a heinous crime? Oh, I'm in no doubt, said Emma. Doris and I take flowers to the graveyard every year on the anniversary of my mother's disappearance, or then-abouts. We have a sense she's buried somewhere there. Sometimes I almost believe I can feel her energy around us, but it's possibly just my imagination playing tricks on me, or what I'm hoping to believe. Did you tell the police about your theories? Asked my mother. Of course we did, but as is always the case, without a body you can't prove a single thing. Doris and I would never want all those grave sites decimated on our accounts, just to search for my mother's remains, based on an erroneous whim that she might just be out there. Imagine how much distress and heartache that would cause among the locals who have their loved ones buried at the site. Sometimes it's best just to let sleeping dogs lie. Do you think it's safe for my kids to be playing in the graveyard in the circumstances, in the woods out there, with your father around? Asked my mother suddenly. I'm just a little concerned about their safety, given the chilling information and the nefarious stuff you've just revealed to us about your father. Of course it's safe, said Emma. My father hates children, especially little girls, but he never laid a hand on us growing up. It was my mother that got all the abuse. Granted, he's got a tongue on him worse than a sailor. He's a nasty piece of work, but he wouldn't harm your kids, believe me, I know. I remember growing up we even had a tiny little poodle called Toddles, and boy did my dad hate that little dog. Toddles would yap at him tirelessly, and I rarely thought my father would thump him on it or make him just vanish or disappear from our lives, but that never happened. It goes without saying that Toddles was subject to a crescendo of verbal abuse by my father, who called the dog a stupid mutt. The only thing you need to watch with my father is his razor-sharp tongue, and you need to stand up to him or he'll eat you alive for breakfast. Well, kids, you heard what Emma said. I think that you keep your distance from Mr. Stevens from now on, when you're playing around the graveyards. Do you understand? Yes, we will, Mum, I said. I know why you love it there, said Emma. Do you know Doris and I would play there all the time as little girls? There's something so fascinating and intriguing about graveyards, and the woods there go back for many miles, and they're spectacular, teeming with all kinds of indigenous wildlife. I do get why you love it there. I really do. And birds too, I said. There's so many lovely birds that we see there. After Emma's stunning revelation about her father, from thenceforth we kept a cautious distance from Mr. Stevens, but it would seem that he was keeping a beady eye on us as well. Stick to the tarmac, kids, he sniped, and don't go riding your bikes on my green turf. I spend an inordinate amount of time keeping it in a pristine condition. I don't need the likes of you messing it all up with those wheels of yours. We never ride our bicycles on the turf, Mr. Stevens, I protested indignantly. You know we don't." "You know, little girl," said Mr. Stevens, "I don't like you one bit. You have a big mouth on you. Don't think for a moment I don't know what's been going on. I know you've been hiding my trowel from me in that oak tree over there, and I know that you're the one pulling my hair the other day. I haven't got time for kiddies' little pranks. I've got grown-up work to do around here, and if you mess around with me, I'll be paying your mother a little visit." "Well, she won't care about that," I said. "We already know you killed your wife, and she's lying dead here in the cemetery. Emma told us what you did." Mr. Stevens's face went as white as a sheet, and all the colour drained from his skin. And in that instant I knew that Emma was exactly right, and that her mother was indeed buried in this graveyard. Mr. Stevens' eyes revealed it all to me. I'd never seen him look so tongue-tied in all his life. He was completely lost for words, and he looked like a guilty puppy whose nose had been dragged to the puddle, who knew exactly what he'd done. "Get lost, kids," he shrieked, and we quickly scurried away on our bicycles, riding down some of the hiking trails into the wood green, until we arrived at the little stream, where we disembarked from our bicycle and took refuge on one of the smooth rocks, where we began to throw stones into the glistening water. "Do you think Mr. Stevens looks guilty?" I said. "Did you not see how white his face was when I mentioned his wife?" "Rather," said Chloe. "I know he killed her, even if it was just an accident." "I think he lost his temper and beat her so hard when she died," said Lola. "I'm certain that's what happened. I think Mr. Stevens is a bad man, but I don't necessarily think he's evil. There is a difference." "Look," I said to my sisters in excitement. "There's a male Blackburnian warbler. We'd wanted to see one of these birds for so very long, and so we all took turns with our binoculars to study the stunning bird. It was sitting on a branch, just chirping away happily. It had a gorgeous orange plumage on its throat and head, with streaks of black and white on the wings. "We must let Mum know what we saw," I said excitedly. "She loves these birds." Our whole family was indeed very keen on bird-watching, and over the last few years we had documented some unusual sightings of birds here at the cemetery. We clambered back hastily onto our bikes and began riding back through the forest towards the smooth tarmac paths of the cemetery. All of a sudden I told my sisters to stop and to park their bikes behind an oak tree, for I had seen something of interest. I cautioned for them to follow me very quietly, and we silently took cover behind a dense briar. We could see a small dark shadowy silhouette creeping behind Mr. Stevens, as Mr. Stevens was digging a grave. This thing, whatever it was, must have been about 3 foot tall, and was covered in long flowing brown hair. I began to focus on the critter with my binoculars, and that was when I saw it. It was moving with such grace, and really rather reminded me of a wild boy, as it had overlong arms and a funny-shaped head, and it was covered in hair. I could see Mr. Stevens wiping his brow, as the sweat poured down his face, which he kept wiping away with the palms of his hands. I saw the wild boy surreptitiously creep up to Mr. Stevens' bottle of lemonade and whisk it away very quickly, and then I watched him bolt behind a large tree and keep its humorous deep-set dark eyes pinned upon Mr. Stevens. "Look," I said, giggling, "the wild boy has stolen Mr. Stevens' lemonade." We watched in amusement as Mr. Stevens went to look for his bottle of lemonade to quench his insatiable thirst, but it was nowhere to be found, and he looked very perplexed. I think he thought he was losing his mind, as he realised he must have left his lemonade in the cooler bag. I could see him shuffling around in the trunk of his black Volkswagen that was parked about 50 feet away from the open grave on the tarmacked road. We watched him bringing out another bottle of lemonade from the cooler bag, which he quickly gulped down thirstily in a few sips, as digging graves is indeed thirsty business. That was when we saw the funny wild boy again. He was returning the lemonade to its original position on the ground, and then he went to hide Mr. Stevens' trowel, placing it behind a large, rather elaborate, elongated gravestone. The wild boy then went to hide behind the tree to watch Mr. Stevens' reactions, and it was easy to see why he enjoyed pranking him so much, as his reactions were indeed hilarious to watch. We were giggling so much when we saw Mr. Stevens' forehead furrow deeply with wrinkles when he saw the lemonade on the grass lying where he thought he had initially left it. He began to scratch his head awkwardly as he stared at the lemonade with a rather stunned, baffled expression upon his face. He was definitely wondering to himself if he was actually losing his mind. We watched him looking around for his trowel. Now where had he put it? He looked very muddled, and then he finally recovered it behind one of the gravestones. Once again he looked at the large gravestone and at the trowel, and began to shake his head in frustration. I think he really was wondering why he had put it in such an obscure place. I warmed immediately to the wild boy, because he had the guts to play tricks on Mr. Stevens, which was something I would not have had the bottle to do myself. In the days that followed, we heartily enjoyed coming to the graveyard, as there had been some highly amusing episodes with the wild boy, who had pulled some hilarious stunts on Mr. Stevens, such as removing the cap off his head when he wasn't watching, and pinching his sandwiches and drinks, as well as always hiding his trowel. I'm convinced Mr. Stevens thought he must be going senile. One day the wild boy, who was hiding behind a large oak tree, began to hurl an avalanche of pine cones and acorns at Mr. Stevens just for fun. I could see the man was not amused, and looked incredibly infuriated. This time he knew he was not losing his mind, and had detected something moving behind the oak tree, which I'm sure he thought was me. I was standing too far away to see what he was actually saying, but I am certain he was mouthing all kinds of nasty obscenities, like "I'll get you, you nasty little kids. Just wait." Mr. Stevens was marching furiously towards the oak tree, oscillating his arms in a seething manner, and his body language left little to the imagination, because it depicted a man that was totally incensed. He lunged swiftly behind the trunk and grabbed the unsuspecting victim by the hair, pulling the bemused little wild boy away from its hiding place towards him. The wild boy let out a huge, ominous howl that was so incredibly loud it reverberated through my chest, literally causing the ground to vibrate from its tonal capacity, and the sound echoed throughout the forest, travelling very far. Mr. Stevens released the wild boy from his grasp with a horrified expression upon his face, for indeed he had no idea what he was beholding. Everything that happened next has been ingrained in my memory for many years, because it was almost as if time stood very still, and everything became eerily quiet. You could hear a pin drop. All of a sudden we could suddenly hear this thundering sound of something very heavy on 2 feet moving through the forest at an alarmingly fast pace. I could compare it to a herd of elephants, but this thing was not on 4 legs. It was clearly bipedal. Then we saw it gliding unhesitantly towards Mr. Stevens. The naughty wild boy pointed his finger accusingly at Mr. Stevens with its overlong hairy arms, and let out another howl. That was all the mother needed to know in order to unleash her fiery wrath upon Mr. Stevens, for there is no mother out there that would not fight to the death to protect her child. It would seem that this hair-covered mother was no different to any other. Mr. Stevens had dared to touch her child, and she was about to show him the cost of his iniquity. I could see Mr. Stevens was shaking violently. I almost felt sorry for him. He seemed paralysed by fear, because he did not attempt to run away, nor did he even scream. I must confess I marvelled at this wild woman. I thought she was marvellously beautiful. She was tall, majestic and lofty, with a very slim, lean body, overlong arms and long flowing chestnut-brown hair, much like her son's, that gleamed in the mid-morning sun. I do vividly recall that her head was shaped like a dome. It blended seamlessly into her shoulders, and I didn't discern a neck, for if she did have one, it must have been very short. The wild woman lunged towards Mr. Stephen unhesitantly, and she tossed him in the air like a frisbee, catching him halfway. And then she deliberately rolled him into the open grave, and let out a raucous scream, which sounded so terrifying, almost like a woman being murdered. Then the wild boy climbed upon her shoulders, and she glided away, moving from the graveyard as if she was floating. That was how graceful she was. Once the wild woman had gone from our sight, my sisters and I ran towards the open grave, and we could see that Mr. Stevens was groaning, and was clearly in agony. "Are you all right, Mr. Stevens?" I asked, glancing down at him in the grave. "All right," snapped Mr. Stevens. "Do I look all right, you stupid girl? Of course I'm not all right. You'd better call the ambulance." When the ambulance arrived and asked Mr. Stevens what had happened to him, he began to talk about monsters tossing him in the air and rolling him into the grave, and everyone thought Mr. Stevens was either going mad or was seriously concussed. Fast forward to a few weeks, and Mr. Stevens was laid up in a hospital bed, having broken his ankle, and was feeling very sorry for himself. I gather that his daughter Emma did finally go and visit him, but she told us that she thought her father was going seriously mad because he kept talking about an ape-like monster attacking him at the gravesite and being too scared to ever go back because next time the monster would definitely kill him. As you can imagine, we never told anybody about the wild boy and his mother. Not because we gave a jot about whether people would believe us or not, or whether they would laugh at us, but because we liked the wild boy and his mother, and we didn't want them to get into trouble or come to any harm. So I guess you could say we were quite protective over them. Needless to say, Mr. Stevens packed up his job as caretaker of the local graveyard, and he moved away from our neck of the woods, and no one knew what had happened to him, because he was never heard from or seen again in our small town. There was, of course, idle speculation among many of the folk there that suggested that he'd moved to Florida. I'm glad to say we enjoyed many more exciting trips to that graveyard without being disturbed by the likes of Mr. Stevens. But I'm sorry to say we never encountered the wild people again, although we always hoped that we would. All these years later, I know the wild people we met, or at least we saw, were Bigfoots. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Rachel, and I'm from Atlanta, which is a bustling, vibrant, diverse city situated among the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains at 1,050 feet above sea level, which is the highest elevation among major cities east of the Mississippi River. It is often referred to as the Big Peach, or the city in the forest, and is the capital and most populated city in the state of Georgia. Atlanta is well known for its award-winning restaurants, art and culture. I happily reside here in a leafy green neighbourhood where I live in a very attractive area north of downtown Atlanta known as Chastain Park with my fun-loving parents and my studious older brother Neil. We live in an elegantly restored old Tudor-style home with a very sizable front and back yard, which is lined with sumptuous green turf, a scattering of pretty trees, and a few colourful flower beds filled with seasonal flowers. My strange, rather incredulous, outlandish Bigfoot story begins in a way that I never imagined possible, for indeed I never considered that a Bigfoot story would ever cross my path, and certainly not in the way that it did. As invariably you always assume that a Bigfoot encounter is rather like the lottery, which means I never thought I would actually hit the jackpot myself. Well, certainly not in quite the way that I did. It all began when the COVID-19 pandemic broke around the world, which made my mother become unduly alarmed about my grandmother, who was in her 80s. At the time, she'd been living in a residential care home where a few people had suddenly just died from COVID. My mother thought that my grandmother might be predisposed and vulnerable to the virus given her age, fragility and weakened immune system, which was why she was desirous for her to move into her house forthwith, an idea that was exceedingly unbecoming to my father, who became very aggrieved and indignant about such a horrifying prospect. For a while, our normally tranquil, peace-loving home became rather like a war zone, where the verbal battles ensued in our sofa-covered living room and carpeted home, as my parents argued incessantly. My obstinate, pertinacious mother invariably always seemed to get her way in the end, and so for a couple of days our house descended into darkness as my sullen father sulked in the corner, barely saying a single word, while my mother prepared the spare room on the first floor of our home for my elderly grandmother Ruth. Within 2 days she'd moved into our home. My grandmother Ruth is a very sweet, frail, elderly woman who's actually as sharp as a hawk and incredibly observant, yet at the same time she's as gentle as a doe. I've always warmed to her because she is such a gentle, warm-hearted and congenial sort of person, and yet at the very same time humorous as well. I remember when I was helping her unpack in her bedroom, she actually said to me, "Oh, I hope I'm not going to be an inconvenience for you all. I can see that your father isn't very happy to have me around, and I can't say I really blame him for that. This is all very awkward for all of us." "Don't worry about him, Granny," I said, giving her a reassuring hug. "Dad's just very set in his ways, that's all. He finds it rather difficult to adjust to different living circumstances. I wouldn't worry about it at all if I was you. He just needs to acclimatise to having you around, and once he's adjusted, He'll be fine, I promise you of that. I know what he's like." "Oh, I hope you're right," chided my grandmother, looking more than a little doubtful. I began to help my grandmother unpack, while she sat back on a comfortable chair watching me and directing me as to where to put her various things. Before long I was placing her neatly folded clothes into various drawers and hanging up all her pretty dresses and coats. I was about to put this long cardboard box into the cupboard when I discerned that it was full of these most magnificent drawings. "Granny," I said in shock, putting the box onto the bed and going through the pictures in awe. "These pictures are absolutely incredible. The colours are marvellous and the drawings are exquisite. Did you draw these?" I asked. "They're stunning." "Yes, I did. When I was a young girl. Well, some of them anyway. Not all of them." "I never knew you were an artist," I said, sifting through the pictures very briefly. "You certainly know how to keep your light hidden under a bushel, Granny. You're a real talent, if ever I saw one." My grandmother chuckled. "That's very kind of you to say so, dear. In those days I enjoyed drawing a great deal. I was a young girl then. It was one thing I could always do that didn't break the bank for my family. We were very poor back then." I sat down on the bed in my grandmother's bedroom and glanced through the pictures very briefly that she had drawn. Some were of her home, the pretty countryside, and even her family. And then there was another picture that caused the hair on the back of my head to stand on end, and my eyes to grow round as saucers, and my jaw to drop to the ground. My grandmother had drawn the perfect picture of a Sasquatch or a Bigfoot. How could she even have known about such a creature, I pondered. I was absolutely stumped. "What's wrong, dear?" she asked, her voice expressing concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost. Your skin has grown as white as a sheet." "Granny," I said, waving the picture of the Bigfoot towards her, "what's this that you've drawn here?" My grandmother giggled. "Oh, that's Mops. Well, that's what my mother used to call him when I was growing up, because his rag-tailed hair looked like a mop. It was long and shaggy. He was a funny old thing, really." "You mean you knew this creature?" I asked, looking absolutely amazed. I sat down on her bed and insisted my grandmother told me the entire story from start to finish. So this is what she told me in her own words, which I now reveal to you. "Well, dear," she proceeded to tell me, "I grew up in the late Depression in the Appalachian, Kentucky area that stretches from Alabama to southern Pennsylvania. It was in the 1930s, and those grueling times were very hard indeed for the all of us, as there was very little employment back then due to the 1929 stock market crash, inexperienced Federal Reserve, and ill-timed tariffs, all collectively contributing to the ailing economy at the time. In those days we had to be very diligent and prudent and learn to survive, and that's what we did back then. We industrially grew our own vegetables and bottled and preserved them for the winter months. We raised chickens for eggs and we had a goat for milk. You really didn't have a choice in the matter, even if you wanted to. We were very frugal in those days, and we had a saying, use it up, wear it out, make do or go without. As a child, I'd scamper around the open wilderness in my bare feet, as shoes then were so expensive and my parents couldn't afford to buy me any. I never owned a pair of my own for a very long time. I would end up getting bitten by insects or spiky thorns would get embedded into my feet. But one day my father used the skins from a dead animal to make me a pair of boots, and that changed my life for the better, as he was a very resourceful man, and I still say to this very day that those boots were the very best I've ever owned. Even though things were very tough and Spartan in those days, I had a beautiful, idyllic and magical childhood, and when you're young and innocent, you believe that the thrifty, provident way that you live is perfectly normal, because you don't know any better. You think that being frugal and penny-wise is the natural way to survive, not like it is today, dear, where there is just so much wastage in absolutely everything. It wasn't like that then. In those days we lived on meagre scant offerings, and we would eat potatoes with onions and hot dogs to fill up, or other cheap foods like beans, brown rice, oats and canned tuna or salmon, or sometimes mac and cheese. I remember one of my favourite foods was biscuits with creamed salmon. We lived in a very small rustic wooden cabin where we shared one queen-size bed together, which was occupied by both of my parents, my older brother Larry, and then me, of course. We would all have to squeeze together in one bed, but during the winter months it was very snug because we would keep each other incredibly warm. As a kid, I loved playing in the wilderness, the vast open prairies, the streams, and the heavily wooded areas on our land. Growing up, Mops was a very normal part of my young life, and I played with him all the time. Of course, he was physically different to me, but when you're young, you accept people at face value and respect them the way they are, without considering their physical differences as strange or peculiar. Indeed, I never thought of such matters in regards to Mops. Granted, he was covered in long flowing brown hair, and he had feet that were padded at the bottom like a cat's, which I used to envy because he'd never get thorns in his feet or anything like that. He was able to run over the rough terrain and even on the snow with ease without getting his feet all cold. He was a creature of few words, but that really didn't matter to me. But he did speak to his mother in a chattering language, which I always found incredibly funny. When I was 10 years old, Mops was already about 5 foot tall and very heavy and stockily built. Not that that ever bothered me at the time. His height or his size was never an issue for me. Sometimes his height was a huge advantage for me, because he could reach the fruit on the trees that I couldn't get to, like peaches and apples, which was great, or biscuits that my mother had hidden from us on the top shelf of the pantry. We would play hide and seek, and Mops could hide in plain sight, and I'd never be able to find him. He was great at just vanishing into thin air, and he loved it when I couldn't discover his hiding spot. It used to drive me completely potty, so eventually he made himself a little easier to find, or I'd have given up on that game in a heartbeat. Yes, but I don't understand is how Mops just became a part of your family and your life in the first place. Well, that's another story, dear. I must have been about 2 years old, and my mother had placed me in a playpen outside my quaint little rustic cabin. It was like a fenced-in area that my father had made out of wooden pegs, to keep me contained. In those days they could not afford toys, but my parents would put pine cones into the playpen and interesting pieces of driftwood, along with paper and crayons for me to play with, and I would be entertained while my mother cleaned out the house, always keeping her steely eyes pinned on me. One day when my mother came out into the yard to attend to my needs, she discovered little Mops had been placed in the playpen next to me. We were playing together very happily, like a couple of naughty juvenile toddlers, although Mops was physically bigger than me at the time. My mother was rather surprised and bewildered to see Mops in the playpen, and she wisely speculated that he was indeed the child of the wild woman, and instinctively sensed she needed her to babysit Mops, so that's exactly what she did. The wild woman would come and collect Mops later in the day, although she was never observed doing so by my mother. I think my mother was secretly pleased that I had a companion to play with, which meant I would get up to less mischief and was kept preoccupied by my little friend. I do remember she scrubbed Mops down a few times with a scrubbing brush and plenty of soap, and brushed out all the knots in his hair with a hairbrush, and he screamed blue murder like a baby because it hurt so much when my mother worked on all those tangles of his. After that fiasco, Mops was always wary of my mother, and when she came after him with a hairbrush, he would run and hide. He was so terrified of that thing, and if he saw a hairbrush, he would start to tremble and wobble like a jelly. If my mother ever wanted Mops to leave the house, all she had to do was wave that hairbrush at him, and he would vanish from sight, and we wouldn't see him for the rest of the day. Every time she upset Mops, he would spray the wall like a domestic cat in revenge and leave the most pungent odour behind in our house that would literally burn the back of your throats and hurt your eyes. It was a putrid smell, rather like hot garbage, and my mother hated it. Did your mother know this wild woman? I asked. No, you see, the introverted wild woman was very reticent, evasive and bashful, but my mother had seen her in passing in the wood green, and their eyes met on many occasions. I think she liked the timorous wild woman and understood her diffidence better than most. You see, growing up, my mother herself had been painfully shy, so she rarely related to the demure wild woman. I know she spotted her capricious elderly partner once or twice in the forest, whom she described as a very sizable, fractious old fellow, whom she believed was a little cantankerous, grouchy, and rather moody. You could tell he was old, as his grey hair was turning white, and his leathery, weathered grey face looked literally ancient and shriveled up like a wizened old tortoise. That was how wrinkled he was. She perceived that the wild woman brought Mops to play with me so that his mischievous games and animated high-pitched whoops would not upset and unnerve the cranky, crotchety old fellow. I do remember when I was playing in the sylvan with Mops, the crusty old fellow heard us as we were chasing each other around the grove. I was shrieking wildly with laughter, and Mops was whooping in delight because he perceived that I'd never catch him, as Mops could run like the wind. I've never seen anything that could run that fast. I will never forget the petulant old fellow who'd been watching us sternly with angry eyes. He lunged towards me, shaking his gargantuan fists at me in a furious rage, and he began to scream so loudly that he sounded like a woman being murdered. Then he curled back his lips and unleashed the most terrifying growl and leered at me with his hostile eyes. I could tell that he was incandescent with rage, which caused my whole body to shake like a leaf. I was certain in that moment that the quick-tempered old man was about to hit me really hard, but that was when the unassuming wild woman came to my immediate rescue. She ushered the old man away, talking to him very softly in a chattering tone that seemed to calm him down. I always got the impression that Mops kept a safe distance from the narky old fellow, as I think he was fickle at the very best of times. He was a scary individual. He was thickly built like an army tank, and was easily over 8 foot tall and even more than 700 pounds, and possibly 3 foot wide. Over the years, the magnanimous wild woman brought my family generous open-handed gifts of deers, hogs, rabbits, fish, and other food sources in exchange for taking care of Mops. We would discover these bountiful trophies on our front door, along with a bucket of wild berries or fruits from time to time, which my mother would bottle or make into delicious jams. As far as my parents were concerned, looking after Mops was a lifesaver for our family. It was like earning a very decent, highly desirable wage package, because it meant we had meat every single day of our lives, which alleviated our hunger pangs and satiated us considerably. It would seem that life became a great deal better and easier for us in our home, because we all went to bed with full satisfied stomachs, thanks to the wild woman, and we were healthier too. My father, whom had never been best pleased about my relationship with Mops and thought it was a bit unusual, shut up after the meat kept arriving on our doorstep, let me tell you that. Whereabouts did Mops live? I asked. Well, he lived in the woods in a cave with his mother and dad. I remember he showed me the place once when we were playing in the grove. You would never have known it was even there. It was concealed by thick brush and thicket, and it was fully protected from all the elements. It was a cosy, sumptuous den, lined with lots of animal pelts and tree stumps and so forth. So how long were you friends with Mops? I asked. I think I was about 12 years old when Mops and his mother went away to pastures new, because they were, like nomads, following waterways, railway lines and animal trails, as that's how the wild men in those days lived. I think the only reason they stayed in our vicinity for so long is because of the grumpy old man, who was tired and weary and incapacitated by his leg that appeared to give him a great deal of trouble. He would drag it on the ground behind him. My mother believed it had once been caught in a trap before and had given him a great deal of grief ever since. She thought that he might have insufferable pain, which could have accounted for his volatile temper. Of course, when he died, everything changed after that. It was a very sad, grievous time for the all of us. Even my father missed the free meat deliveries at our front doorstep, and life went downhill from then on, as we had to resort to living on beans and rice, and it wasn't easy, let me tell you. How did the old man die? I asked. Well, I remember one day the wild woman beckoned to my mother and indicated for her to follow her, which was a very big deal for us because she was desperately shy, and although she would make her presence known, she liked to remain hidden in the shadows. We barely ever saw her unless she crossed our path and glanced at us ever so briefly. On this occasion, however, the wild woman stepped out of her comfort zone, which wasn't easy for her at all, and she led my mother to the open grave that she had dug in the grove, only yards away from where the cave was where the family lived. I remember getting such a shock when I observed the old man lying next to the open grave, with his deceased body. It was so withered. I could see that despite his great size and girth, he was emaciated and drawn. I'd never seen a dead body before that, and in my eyes he was very human to me, despite all the hair and his gargantuan size. I must say he looked very peaceful in death. My mother believed he'd died in his sleep or something, and you could see that the wild woman loved him so very much. I could discern the distress in her eyes, and how desperately sad she was. I remember my mother took the wild woman into her arms, and they locked in a warm embrace. She patted her gently on her hair-covered back, and she kept saying, "I'm so sorry, you poor, poor thing. It must be very hard for the both of you." The wild woman really looked comforted by my mother's kind, gentle words, and the compassion that she showed her. I could tell that she loved my mother very much, even though they had so little contact. She patted my mother's back as well. It was an emotional, loving embrace. Was Mop sad about his dad's death? No, not really. I think he was actually rather relieved, to tell you the truth. I sensed his fractious relationship with his father was combustible at the very best of times. I think the poor old man possibly found Mops rather too rambunctious and feisty for his liking. So what happened next? Well, the wild woman buried the old man while we all watched the procedure. It was really rather peculiar, but she wanted to include us in the ceremony, and I realised then that she considered us a huge part of her life, which was incredibly moving, especially for my mother, who was touched to the quick. I noticed Mama was actually crying when the old man was buried. I think she was so sad for the wild woman. Once the old man was buried, the wild woman put some sticks into the ground to mark the grave, and then she let out the most appallingly loud howls. I even began to weep when she howled, because you could feel her desperate pain. And then once she'd finished grieving, she pointed towards the east, and my mother knew that they were leaving and moving on. We were all grievously sad, and said our goodbyes. I remember we patted each other on the backs and nodded, and I just wept and wept when I saw them go. It really felt like a death and a dreadful loss. I was so sad. I remember after they left, life got really hard again. Obviously, we no longer had the meat deliveries from the wild woman, and I missed Mop so much. He had been my very best friend growing up. I never stopped crying for days. I used to beg God to bring him back to us, but he and his mother, they never returned. I begged God to make them return, but it just never happened. My mother believed that the wild woman, who was still very young at the time, had possibly found a new love. My mother was so sad. She told me she never realised how much the wild people had impacted her life. We always went to the grave of the old man and prayed for him and laid down flowers for him on the anniversary of his death every single year. "Wow," I said, "what a story." I said this looking at the picture my gran had painted of the critter with a pyramid-shaped head, overlong arms and hair-covered body. As my grandmother looked at the picture, I could see the tears welling in her eyes and streaking and falling down her cheeks as she remembered little Mops. "So this is Mops," I said, studying the picture. "It's a really good picture. He looks really sweet. His eyes look very kind." My grandmother was still crying, wiping away her tears. "Oh, he was kind," she said, "very kind." "And if you think that's a good picture," she said, "look at these." My grandmother showed me some other pictures that had been meticulously done by a fine artist. "Who did these?" "These were done by Mops." "Mops drew these pictures?" I asked in astonishment. My grandmother nodded. "He was a great artist, and we would draw together for hours. He was far better than me. He knew how to draw the natural world. You see, he knew it so much better than I did." "That's extraordinary," I said. "He was such a phenomenal artist. I can't believe it." Suddenly I remembered the picture from the Patterson gymlan footage, and I took out my mobile phone and showed the footage to my grandmother. I wanted to see what she thought of the creature that many have speculated for so long and wondered if it was real. "What do you think of this footage, Granny?" I asked. "That looks a lot like the wild woman," said my grandmother, "only she was much taller and slimmer. But she did look like that. It's a great footage," she said, "and it's definitely real. It's not fake. You can see the muscles moving under the arms, and you can see the areas where the animal doesn't have hair. That was similar to the wild woman." As you can imagine, I was thrilled that my grandmother could share this story with me, and if she had not stayed in our home, I would never have known about her encounter with the hairy man. I told my grandmother that the critters are known as Bigfoot, but she said Mops and the Wild Woman were like people to her, but people with hair and pyramid-shaped faces and very powerful, strong bodies. But they're just like us, she told us, with emotions and feelings. Don't ever forget that. You cannot say they're animals because they're intelligent and discerning. I did tell her that some people had terrifying encounters with the critters, and she believes that they are actually misunderstood. They do have an intrinsic ability to read your mind, she did tell me. I do know Mops was always able to know what I was thinking. And that was proven one day when we played a game where I'd draw a picture on a piece of paper and he had to guess what I'd drawn. And he always got it right. If I drew an apple or a house, he drew exactly what I'd drawn. So he was very, very telepathic. I imagine if a hunter was thinking I'm going to kill this wild man, he would be in pretty much big trouble, because the wild man would already have perceived his thoughts and quickly defend himself. Also, if you display fear, that would be a red flag to a wild man. You see, the wild man would see your fear as an invitation to attack, as all the other animals they hunt are afraid of them as well. But do you believe that there are bad wild men? Of course I do, just as there are bad men in our world. It really is not much different than that. The problem is if you're dealing with an aggressive wild man, you'll be in big trouble because they're colossal, dangerous, and they'll kill you in a heartbeat. My grandmother still lives in our house to this day, and my father has warmed to her considerably because she's a very likeable old lady. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my story that I'm going to share with you happened in Washington State in the early 90s when I was about 30 years old at the time and unmarried with a very loving, devoted cat called Basil, who was my beloved, very special companion. What I've always loved about cats is they're so independent, and they're independent enough to be left for hours at a time without needing any supervision, which of course was very convenient for me, as I was out working during the day. I was living in Stevens County at the time, which is located on the Canada-US border, and I was renting an apartment in the neighbourhood close to the city of Colville, where I was working at a local florist shop, assisting my best friend, the shop owner Katrina, into creating the most fabulous floral displays for people for every single occasion, like red roses for Valentine's Day, poinsettias, holly and Christmas roses for Christmas time, orange blossoms, lily, roses, jasmine and gardenias for weddings, and roses, gladioles, carnations and snowdrops for birthdays. Last but not least, lilies, orchids, chrysanthemums, roses and carnations for funerals. Business was booming for us, and we relied heavily on a local driver called Bobby to deliver the flowers to our customers in our delivery van. But one afternoon he failed to show up from a drop-off, and there was still an outstanding delivery to do. So I told Katrina that I would drop off the flowers for her as it wasn't too far out of my way. I did not know at the time that this one delivery would ultimately change my life forever. "Oh, will you?" said Katrina, giving me a kiss on the cheek. "That would be a huge help," she said. "I wonder where on earth Bobby has got to. It's not like him to be so late. I do hope everything's all right with him." I gathered the attractive arrangement of carnations, roses, ribbons and lilies, along with the deepest sympathy card attached, and packed it carefully into the back of my trunk. It was the least I could do for Katrina, as over the years she had become a faithful, devoted friend to me, and had helped me during a very challenging, tumultuous time in my life. I had been living with an abusive, aggressive boyfriend at the time, whom I had courageously chosen to leave, but I was left really stranded and high and dry with no money or job. I remember just breaking down into tears on the street corner as I had hit rock bottom in my life, and I had nowhere to turn for help, and the helpless despair I felt was pernicious. On noticing my obvious distress from the florist's window across the street, Katrina had whisked me into the florist shop like a fairy godmother and made me a big hot cup of tea with lots and lots of sugar to calm me down. Then, like a bird with a broken wing, she had taken me under her diligent charge, and I had never looked back. I was now an independent, free-spirited maverick with a fabulous job, and it was all thanks to Katrina, who had put her faith in me and taught me all about arranging flowers. I had surprised myself by really showing a natural individualistic aptitude and flair for flower arranging. We were now running this thriving business together as a victorious team, and we had become like soul sisters, not to put too fine a point on it. In truth, the delivery place was really out of the way for me, but I didn't care at all, as I was eager to assist Katrina in every way. I discovered that my bright red Dodge Stealth was not really equipped to tackle the rocky, precipitous, uneven road that led to the property for my drop-off, but I really wasn't bothered. I was going to deliver these flowers, come hell or high water. I realised that the drop-off was well off the beaten track in a secluded wilderness area, surrounded by exquisite verdant rolling valleys, pretty flowery meadows, quaint little barns, and ubiquitous trees, not to mention silvery lakes. While indeed it was spectacularly beautiful, it really was rather remote and isolated. Still, it wasn't too late. I glanced briefly at my watch. It was 4:30 in the afternoon, and I still had an hour before it got dark, as it was early spring. I drove down the long windy gravel driveway, fringed on either side by magnificent towering oak trees. I parked my car outside the door of a very arresting colonial home and made my way to the immaculate dark blue front door, with its gold horseshoe knocker, which I rapped a couple of times. I was carrying the large bouquet of flowers in my hand. As I waited for the door to be answered, I could hear feet coming to the door, and then the next thing I knew was that the front door was being flung open, and a young woman bustled me into the kitchen and was busying herself with a kettle and insisting that I sat down. I could see that she was very flustered, and I was eager to be of help. "Are you all right?" I asked, looking at her with deep concern. "Forgive me for saying so, but you do look rather frantic, troubled and overwrought." "I'm so glad you came," said the woman. "My name is Candace, by the way. I really could do with a friend right now. My life has been a roller coaster ride since my son went missing, and I feel completely overwhelmed by everything. It's like I can't see the wood for the trees, nor can I even think straight." "Your son is missing?" I asked, looking at her in horror. "How dreadful! What do you think happened to him?" "That's what I'd like to know," said Candace, fumbling away at the kettle awkwardly. "Would you like coffee or tea?" she asked. "Whatever you're having will be fine," I said, looking at the woman with great empathy. It was terrible to lose a child. I couldn't imagine a worse fate. I studied Candace with a keen interest. I could see that she was an emotional wreck, but then who wouldn't be? I could tell she hadn't been sleeping, as under her eyes revealed dark telltale bags, and her pretty blonde hair was tousled around her face as if it hadn't seen a hairbrush for weeks. Candace was shaking as she placed down my cup and saucer and handed me a couple of chocolate biscuits. "Sit down," I insisted. "I want you to tell me your whole story. Take it from me, it really helps to talk things through. I've hit rock bottom myself before, and it's not a pretty place to be. And I'll do anything to help you." "You're right," she said, sitting down on the opposite side of the counter and clasping her hands around her head, with a look of grievous despair upon her face. "Where do I begin?" she said. "It was about 3 months ago, when my 11-year-old son, Logan, told me he was going into the woods to play with Piper, who I believed in the very early days was a fictitious friend of his that he'd made up, due to him being very lonely, although I have since learnt that 11-year-old boys are not predisposed to making up imaginary friends. They usually do that sort of thing when they're much younger. After a while I'd see him playing with Piper, and then I realised his friend was indeed real and not fictitious at all. And despite the unusual nature of their friendship, I was agreeable to it. I could see that Logan was becoming so much happier now that he had a friend. Piper is out there on the patio looking very distressed, poor thing. I think he has no idea what's happened to Logan, and you can see he's so broken up about it." "Did Piper see anything?" I asked. When your son vanished, that is." "I wish I could ask him, but the trouble is I don't think he speaks a word of English, and the moment I open the patio door, he flees away like a frightened feral cat." "Where is he?" I asked. "Maybe I can talk to him. I'm quite good with young children." "Be my guest," said Candace, leading me to the glass patio door, where, sitting perched on the step with long arms around knees and back straight up, I could see what I can only describe as a small boy, but this was no ordinary boy, as he was covered in long, flowing hazelnut hair, and his head was shaped like a dome that folded seamlessly into his shoulders. "What is that?" I asked, looking at Candace in surprise. "It looks like a boy covered in hair." "Well, he is. I call him a wild boy," said the woman. "My son's told me so many incredulous, wonderful stories about his friendship with Piper and his family. He's a very solid friend of Logan's. They don't make friendships like this anymore. This boy is so loyal to my son. My son's an only child, you see. His father died shortly after he was born, so it's been him and me against a rather hostile, belligerent, aggressive and antagonistic world, I'm afraid to say. I did realise that Piper coming into his life was indeed a miraculous blessing for the both of us. There are others of his kind living in the woods, of course, but they're very elusive and reticent, always keeping a rather safe distance. I only ever saw the mother once. She was quite scary looking, really, big and powerful, but from what Logan told me, Piper's mother has a heart on her of absolute gold, and a serene, gentle, very loving nature. It's ironic, really, given how frightening she appears. It would seem that impressions can be rather misleading. Well, I do believe some of the biggest monsters are of the human kind, and they come in small, attractive packaging, like my ex-boyfriend. He was a monster of note, but that's a whole nother story, I told Candace. I studied Piper for a while. The wild boy, sensing he was being watched, looked exceedingly awkward and uncomfortable, as he didn't appreciate being scrutinised by my inquisitive eyes. He stood up, glanced in our direction, looking directly at us with his deep-set, dark, sad eyes, and I was visibly astounded by how human his face appeared. The wild boy hurriedly turned around and trotted speedily into the woods, moving faster than a horse in his eagerness to escape us, and vanishing from our sight very, very swiftly. The only way I can describe him to you is that he had the face of a boy, and was about 3 foot tall, with ape-like influences to his appearance that were most notable in his overlong arms and his short legs. Are you sure this wild boy hasn't got something to do with Logan's disappearance? It's a question that has to be asked. No, definitely not, said Candace. On the contrary, I think Piper has been watching over my son very protectively, like an older brother, and getting him out of all sorts of scrapes. According to Logan, he's been friends with this wild boy for over a year. If anything untoward were to have happened, it would have already done so. And besides, Piper's family are incredibly protective over Logan. They treat him as one of their own. Do you know, after he disappeared, his mother left me a huge amethyst stone on my doorstep as a sign of her support. Let me show it to you. It's really stunning. Wow, I said, studying the stone. This is seriously magnificent. You'd pay an absolute fortune for something like this in one of those mystic stores. Well, it's very precious to me, said Candace, touching the stone lovingly. In a strange way, it helps me to feel connected to my son, as odd as it sounds. I've been watching poor Piper there, through that window pane, for several long days now. I don't know why he comes so close to my house, but it might be his way to feel connected to Logan. Ever since Logan vanished, he's been kicking around leaves and just sitting there on the step, staring into space. He seems so lost and sad without Logan, almost as if he's grieving. I know he's missing his friend desperately. Maybe he comes close to the house to show you that you're not alone in your grief, and that he feels your pain too, I said. Well, I hadn't thought of it like that, said Candace. Now let me tell you my story, she said, chaperoning me back to the kitchen. I want to see if you can make any sense of what I'm going to tell you, because believe me, I can't. As you can imagine, I'm never too comfortable with Logan playing out there in the woods by himself, but as a mother you cannot smother your child, nor can you rob them of going exploring or having fun. Boys will be boys, and that's the way it has to be. You can't mollycoddle them, or wrap them up in cotton wool, as they will never thank you for that. Anyway, one day Logan returned home from playing in the woods with Piper. He informed me that he had encountered a very strange, rather peculiar woman there. She was sitting on a rock overlooking the stream and staring into the silvery surface. I gather she was singing an intriguing, rather pretty song, and my son, who is reticent and very reserved by nature, said he felt unusually drawn to the beguiling woman, almost as if she had surreptitiously thrown out an invisible fishing line with an alluring bait at the very end, and was winding my son in. He said he walked over to where she was sitting. It would seem Piper was literally frantic and frenzied, and was trying to stop Logan from approaching the woman. He sensed something was up. But Logan refused to take any notice of Piper. My son said that the woman was very pretty, with long flowing brown hair, fair skin and hazel eyes. I gather she was wearing very bohemian clothes, like a long flowery dress, with a waistcoat and a straw hat. This bewitching woman stopped singing immediately when Logan approached her. and began to chat to him in a very smooth, buttery voice. My son said he sensed there was something outer-worldly about her. He discerned when he was talking to her a rather artificial-looking fiery purple spark in her eyes that sent horrifying chills down his spine and made his blood turn icy cold. In that moment he couldn't walk away. It was like that this woman had some kind of invisible hold on him, almost as if she'd locked him in a hypnotic trance of some kind. He described the feeling as being like an animal caught up in a trap and unable to escape. And the more you tried to flee, the tighter the noose around the neck became. He said it felt exactly like that. Good grief, I said. The woman obviously had some kind of invisible power. How did he get away from her, I asked. Would you believe it? His faithful wild friend Piper came to his immediate rescue and began hurling large stones at the woman, and she began screaming all kinds of obscenities that were so vile they can't be repeated. I gather she ran away because of the stones, but she was far from happy because things hadn't turned out as she had expected. You think this insidious woman has something to do with your son's disappearance, don't you? I asked. Oh, I'm in no doubt about that, said Candace. Who or what that woman was, I can't even begin to imagine, and I sometimes wonder if she was human at all. Tell me, she said, how do you go telling the police any of this nonsensical, outlandish stuff, which sounds so far-fetched, it's difficult to even get your own head around? When the police were asking me about the woman, and I mentioned the artificial purple spark in her eyes that my son had seen, both officers looked at each other, rolled their eyes at the back of their heads. You could see what they were thinking. Here we go again. Another complete crackpot who's completely lost her marbles. We can't believe a single word she says. As you can imagine, I clammed up after that, like an oyster in a shell, and I refused to tell them much. I didn't even tell them about the wild boy, as they already thought I belonged in the loony bin, and I didn't want to give them any more ammunition to use against me. I can understand exactly what you feel like, I said. I think in your shoes I'd have done much the same. Tell me, did your son see this frightful woman again? He most certainly saw her in the woods. He tried to avoid her, but once again he felt pulled towards her, and before he knew it he was standing at the edge of the stream talking to this woman again. He said he doesn't even know how that happened. He told me he did not even remember walking over to her. He was hoping that Piper would rescue him by throwing stones at the woman, but that never happened. Instead, he went to get his mother for help. The next thing he knew was that he saw 3 men coming towards him. They were obviously assisting the woman. They grabbed him by the arms and threw him into the back of an RV, locking the door behind him. And Logan began kicking the door and screaming at the top of his lungs, "Let me out! Let me out!" He began shouting and thumping and hitting, but they just ignored him. I gasped, "That is so terrible." My son said that suddenly you could hear the most horrifying scream, which caused his kidnappers to scatter. It was clear they were terrified by the commotion. Logan was not scared as he knew it was Piper's mother, and she had a pair of lungs on her that could make the ground quake under its intense vibration. I mean, she's a colossal creature, majestic and very big. She must weigh at the very least 700 pounds, or possibly even more, and she's easily over 8 foot tall. Anyway, when she runs, Logan says that she sounds exactly like a rhino in the thicket on a full charge. Logan, on seeing the large silhouette of Piper's mother, waved frantically from the RV window to get her attention, and that critter broke down the RV door with little difficulty, pulling Logan out of the van, throwing him over her shoulders like a sack of potatoes, and running with him swiftly all the way home, returning him safely to me. "Let me get this right," I said. "You're saying that the wild boy's mother rescued Logan from a locked RV by breaking down the door. She must be incredibly strong to be able to do that. Those doors are remarkably tough." "Well, that's what I'm saying. She is incredibly strong." "From what you're telling me, it sounds like this human woman is up to no good. It's clear she wanted to kidnap Logan, but why?" "That's what I want to know," said Logan's mother. "Why? That is the very big question. I mean, my son is not from a very wealthy family, so kidnapping for ransom has to be out of the question. I'd also like to know who those 3 men were that threw Logan into the van. Another thing Logan did tell me, What that really got my attention was that all three men had the same artificial purple glint in their eyes, much like the woman had. Now that's not normal, nor is that human. I remember he told me that you could feel that they were menacing and evil. So something very nefarious has to be going on there. But what, I can't imagine. Well, what I want to know, Candace, is why these people, if they're people at all, and if you ask me, I don't think anyone who treats a child like that is human, you have to ask yourself why they're so interested in your son, as after all the first 2 times they tried to snatch him, they weren't successful at all. You would think that they would have given up by now, especially after being scared off by Piper's mother. I mean, that must have been one hell of a hair-raising event, if ever I saw one. Yet it seems that they haven't been put off at all by any of the setbacks that they've incurred. Doesn't that strike you as odd? Doesn't it make you ask yourself why? Why are they trying again? And why were they successful? Is there something about your son that makes him extra special, do you think? Well, there is, as a matter of fact, but I don't know why that should make any difference. My son's deceased father was Mongolian, and he has that rare AB blood group that affects only 1% of the population. Wow, I said, that is quite a big deal. I mean, 1% of the population is exceedingly rare. It does make me wonder if these people were after your son's blood type. It is a distinct possibility. You cannot rule it out as a motive for sure. Oh, I hope not, said Candace. I dread to think what they could have done to him. Imagine if they've killed him. Look, Candace, I said, I so wish I had the answers for you, but I really don't. And I'm not going to lie to you and pretend that everything is rosy in the garden, because it's clearly not. If you want my personal, honest opinion, I think those people, whoever they are, finally managed to kidnap your son. And whoever they were, there's something not right about them, something not human. We've established that. I also wonder if they've done this before to other children, I mean. There could be all kinds of possibilities, from aliens to Satanists to anything. There could be any motive for why they've taken your son. I do remember Logan mentioning to me that on the kitchen area of the RV was a large bowl filled with dozens of kids' watches that could potentially have belonged to other children. That's a very distinct possibility, but you can't rule everything out. It is possible that the person could have just collected watches. I'm trying to look at every angle, with a sceptic outlook, of course. Of course, said Candace. I need your input. What's that? I asked suddenly. Can you hear it? It sounds like a strange chattering sound, almost as if 2 people are speaking in Cantonese. Oh, that's Piper's mother. Piper must have returned to my patio again, after we returned to the kitchen to have a bit of tea. He seems hell-bent on hanging out there to be as close to Logan as he possibly can. I imagine his mother has come to collect him. I think she doesn't like him hanging around there, feeling sorry for himself. Do you mind if I go and have a look? I said. I'd love to see what Piper's mother looks like. I'm very intrigued. Be my guest, said Candace, but try not to be seen, because Piper's mother is very evasive and exceedingly shy. She's worse than Piper. I cautiously peered through the crack in the curtain and saw a massive creature talking to Piper in a very strange language that, as I said before, did sound like Cantonese. Piper's mother was so tall and statuesque and very lean, but strong and powerful at the same time, with a very large chest area, small pert breasts, and very overlong arms that made her legs almost appear short by contrast. I did discern that this mysterious creature was much more human-like than that of an ape. She was covered in long, flowing hazelnut hair, and possessed dark tan skin that looked leathery, a flat nose, deep-set brown eyes, and a very feminine long face. I could see by the gestures and body language that Piper looked very distressed. It was clear that the wild boy felt close to his friend Logan, being near to the house. He didn't seem to want to venture into the woods, and was putting up a bit of a stormy fight by oscillating his arms like an octopus and refusing to budge. The mother looked like she was beginning to lose her cool and get rather tough on him, and then reluctantly, with his head hanging low, he eventually followed his mother back into the woods. Poor thing, I said to Candace. I think Piper is very faithful. I'm not sure even a human child would be this devoted. I can see he's completely shredded up about your son. I don't know how I ever imagined he could be guilty of your son's disappearance. I told you, said Candace, those two were soul brothers, and you mark my words in that. Candace and I became great friends over the years. I regret to have to tell you that Logan was never found again, despite the extensive searching and all the investigations. It would seem that he disappeared off the face of the earth, never to be seen or heard from again. But those people with the purple glint in their eyes are my prime suspects, if they're people at all. Who or what are they? That's what I'd like to know. One is left with one conclusion, that our reality is a lot more mysterious than we give it credit for. Candace was so broken up by the whole ordeal that she eventually adopted a Mongolian child in order to bring some purpose back into her life, and indeed, it really did. All these years later, she still lives in that exquisite house of hers, overlooking acres of forest and beautiful rolling green countryside. I think Piper's mother and Piper have long since moved away, as Candace hasn't seen sight or sound of them for many years. We both realise now that Piper and his mother were Sasquatches or Bigfoots. In the 90s, we hadn't heard of such critters existing, but now, with all the exposure, we realise what they are. Believe me, these Bigfoots were the gentlest giants you've ever seen in your life, with the most generous, compassionate hearts. Nowadays, I hear the most terrible things said about Sasquatches, which really contradicts what I saw with my own eyes. So I would just like to say, don't be too hasty to allow one bad apple to contaminate the entire cartload. Katrina and I no longer run a florist in the city anymore, but we do work together as a team, as event planners, and we organise floral arrangements for all kinds of functions all over Washington. So I'm left all these years later with one question: what did happen to Logan Wallace?
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Sherry, and I'm from the southeastern American state of Kentucky, known as the Bluegrass State, sectioned by the Ohio River in the north and the Appalachian Mountains to the south. Frankfurt is our state capital, and Louisville our largest city. We are also known as the horse capital of the world, as there are so many thoroughbred farms here in the Lexington area, and we're renowned for possessing some of the most prepossessing, charming small towns in the States. Growing up in the early 80s, I was exceedingly fortunate to grow up in a small pastoral farm in close proximity to a very pretty, quaint small town, full of southerly charm and very warm, friendly, convivial people, where everybody knew each other, and gossip in those days was literally our only form of social media, as we didn't have the technology that we have today. In our town, we did have our local talebearer, or newsmonger if you like, who was a very discerning, inquisitive woman called Mrs. Eleanor Partridge, who did possess those quintessential beady hawk-like eyes that gave you the very distinct impression that she saw everything and missed nothing, for indeed she appeared to know everybody else's business, and I always wondered where she got her accurate information from. It would seem that she knew things long before the rest of the townsfolk ever did, but credit to her, she was rather a good judge of character. "I don't like Farmer Townsend," she told us once. "There's something exceedingly nefarious about him that gives me the heebie-jeebies. Those creepy eyes of his are as cold as the ice cubicles in my freezer, and if I ever see him smile at all, the crystal in my home will just shatter from the shock. As for that poor wife of his, I don't think I've ever heard her say a single word. She looks so demure and afraid, poor thing, like a mouse that's petrified of the house cat. And I think we can safely assume that the house cat she's terrified of is Mr. Townsend himself, her very own husband. Farmer Silas Townsend lived in the neighbouring farm to us, and as far as we knew, no one in the town had ever been invited around to his property, which was more than a little odd, because in those days people entertained a great deal, as southerly social hospitality was an inherent and intrinsic part of our lifestyle. Most of the people kept a wary distance from Silas Townsend. It was clear that no one would sit next to him in the church pew, and if he was walking on your side of the pavement, you would instinctively cross over to the other side, almost as if you were avoiding bumping into the aggressive dog. It's hard to explain, but he gave off that creepy kind of vibe. To look at, he was relatively normal, rather unremarkable really. He had a slender, very medium build, and it was hard to tell exactly how old he was, At the time I would have guessed he was in his 40s. I remember he did have a long angular face and a thin mouth that always seemed to be turned upside down, as if he was always scowling, and he had a deep-set pair of soulless dark brown eyes. My stout, buxom, fun-loving mother was always wearing an apron around her ample form and waving around a wooden spoon in her hand. She was a great southern cook, and in her day had been quite a beauty, but her love of soul food had cost her waistline dearly. My amazing mother had a heart like the softest marshmallow, as she just always saw the good in everybody, and she came to Mr. Townsend's defence when people ever talked badly about him. "Poor Mr. Townsend," she piped. "People around here are so cruel and heartless in an unkind way. Just because he doesn't smile and is so evasive does not mean that he's a nasty man. Maybe he's just misunderstood." "You just see the good in everybody, Annie," said my father, kissing her lovingly on the cheek. "That's why I love you so much, as there's not a mean bone in your body. But you're wrong about this, dear. You mark my words. Something's not right about Mr. Townsend." Growing up, I was incredibly close to my father, who was self-employed and spent his time restoring and fixing fences for farms in the area. My father always described me as his blue-eyed girl, so he called me Peaches. I had 4 brothers, all older than me, and so I think my father was so delighted to finally have a daughter, and we had a very special father-daughter bond. Our picturesque rustic farm in those days had 2 large silvery ponds, a very sizable stables, a couple of quaint-looking barns with arresting red roofs, pretty wild meadows, and undulating verdant valleys that were dotted with ubiquitous trees such as red maple, cypress, beeches. And it was at this very special time of the day that we would see the charming indigenous wildlife frequenting the pond to drink, like the aloof-looking deer, or the cautious raccoons, or we would watch the rabbits bobbing around our lawn happily. In our town there had been reports of a wild man living in the local area that had been sighted from time to time, and he was described as being like a giant, covered in hair with very overlong arms. But sightings of the man had been so brief and random, so no one knew much about him, and some suggested that the reports were just fictitious, with no real foundation or evidence, and others suggested it was just a vagrant on the loose who had grown very wild. One day, as my dad and I were returning home from a shopping trip to the local town, we encountered Mrs. Partridge at the local store, who'd filled us in on all the gossip. "Do you know," she told us, "I saw Mrs. Townsend at the hospital the other day. She was being treated for a broken wrist, and I could tell she was walking very badly because she was hobbling around as if she'd hurt her leg. I promise you that Mr. Townsend is a snake in the grass. You mark my words. I'm willing to bet he did this to her." "That's a bit extreme, Mrs. Partridge," said my father. "Mr. Townsend may not be the most likeable man in the town, but I hardly think he's a monster. There's possibly a very plausible explanation as to what has happened to her. She probably just slipped and fell." Well, what I did learn was that Mr. Townsend informed the doctor that his wife had a nasty fall down their staircase, but there's more to this than meets the eye. I saw Mrs. Townsend being treated by that doctor, and she looked so frightened, poor thing. "What were you doing at the hospital, Miss Partridge?" asked my father quizzically. "Oh, I just like to drop off some flowers to the reception from time to time, to brighten the place up, and to speak to the lovely ladies there," she told us. When my dad and I got back into our car for the drive back home, we both cracked up with laughter. "I can see it clearly," said my father. "I think I can safely say that Mrs. Partridge, bless her soul, is visiting the hospital not to drop off flowers, but to find out all the latest gossip. That woman has a nose on her for a good story." "She should be a reporter," I said. "I think she would be a great gossip columnist." "Good point," said my father. "She could put those other journalists out there to shame, because she'd get the scoop long before they even got the chance to get it. They just make things up as they go, but Mrs. Partridge always gets the facts." As my father and I were driving back down the uneven, craggy dirt road towards our farm, we noticed something very large standing in the corner of the road. Our first thought was that it was a bear, as it was covered in long flowing hair, and was very large in size. "Look, a bear," said my father, slowing down the car as we drove past. It was not uncommon to see a bear in these parts, of course, but this one was a lighter brown colour. All of a sudden the creature stood upright on his two powerful muscular long legs, and his shoulders and head turned around at the same time to look at us directly. We couldn't believe what we were discerning, as the creature was most certainly not a bear. The only way I can describe him to you is that he looked like a giant man, covered with long flowing brown hair, with a few ape-like influences to his appearance, mostly seen in his cone-shaped head and his overlong arms. But in every other capacity he was alarmingly human. I realised that these spurious reports, allegations and accounts were possibly true. Everything suddenly happened so quickly, as the last thing my dad wanted to do was to presumptuously stop the car and stare or ogle at the critter like an animal in the zoo, because that seemed so impertinent, rude and discourteous, especially when the creature was so human. So he just slowed down his driving pace to get a good view of the wild man, who just stared in at us as we drove by. All I remember was that he was absolutely enormous, and his deep-set dark brown eyes seemed inquisitive but also kind. My father estimated that the wild man must have easily been over 8 foot tall, 700 pounds, and about 3 foot wide across the shoulder area. And incidentally, his shoulders were massive, as indeed his whole body was sinewy, fibrous and muscular. I do not recall us being frightened at all. We possibly should have been, given the size of this wild man. I think my father and I were caught so off guard and assailed by surprise, as we hadn't anticipated such a random, unexpected encounter, and I believe we were way too astonished and bewildered for fear to even creep into the equation. When you see something so outlandish and incredulous for the first time, I think it has the capacity to desensitize your emotional alarm response, because it seemed like what you're perceiving is so preposterous that it can't really be real. I remember as we drove back down the dirt road towards our farmhouse, my father and I did not say a single word for quite a while. It was like we were so stunned that we could not articulate our thoughts into words, and it was so deathly silent in our car you could have almost heard a pin drop. My father turned around to me and said, "Peaches, did we really see what I thought we saw? Or was I dreaming?" "You mean, did we see the giant wild man?" I said. "Well, yes, we did." As you can imagine, my father and I literally could not wait over the dinner table that night to tell everybody what we'd seen returning home from the store. "Peaches and I have a little secret to share with you all," my father announced, winking at me. "Shall I tell them, Peaches, or do you want to?" "We saw a wild man today," I piped excitedly. "He was like a giant covered in hair." "You saw the wild man?" said Garth, one of my brothers. "That's not fair. Where did you see him?" "Close to the farm," I said, glancing around at the glum faces, as it was clear to see that all my brothers felt remarkably cheated not to have seen him for themselves. My mother began to clear away the dinner plates. Poor wild man," she said. "I so wish we could invite him over for dinner. It can't be easy living out there in the wild like that. I imagine his body is adapted to the cold, which is why he's probably grown all that body hair. I expect he has to hunt for all his food. I so wish I could offer him some of my delicious apple pie." "He's a wild man, sweetheart," exclaimed my father. "He possibly wouldn't understand our way of life, any more than we could understand his. I imagine he's a forager and a hunter, just like the ancients used to be. It's all he knows. He doesn't understand our way of life." Fast forward a few weeks, and one morning we could see the small willowy body of Mrs. Townsend knocking frantically at our front door. What on earth was she doing on our farm, I wondered, and why was she still wearing her nightgown at 11 o'clock in the morning? More to the point, she looked very discomposed and distressed, and her normally neatly ponytailed hair looked very dishevelled. My mother quickly led her into the living room, while I hid behind the couch, because my inquisitive curiosity had got the better of me, as I was eager to find out what on earth was going on, for this was a very impromptu call. and I'd never ever seen Mrs. Townsend on her own, nor had I ever heard her say a single word. "That's better," said my mother. "The colour's coming back to your cheeks, dear. They use brandy all the time in the Swiss Alps when they rescue people from the icy mountain slopes, from avalanches and things like that with their St. Bernards. It's so great for shock. Do you want to tell me what's going on, dear?" "Silas is dead," she said. You could hear a pin drop in the room as everything became airily silent. "Silas is dead," she repeated. "Oh, I'm so sorry," said my mother. "I don't know what to say. When on earth did this happen?" "Last night, at about 10:30 to be precise." "Wow, I never knew Silas had any health issues," said my mother. "I do hope he didn't suffer. Was it a heart attack or a stroke, dear?" "Silas didn't have any health problems." "Oh, my dear, I'm so sorry," said my mother. "I think that's almost worse, really." "I'm not," said Seraphine, which was the first name of Mrs. Townsend. "He deserves everything he got. He was a mean old bully. He never stopped beating me up day or night. I promise you the littlest thing would set him off, like if I didn't pass him the salt or pepper at the dinner table, or if I left a smudge mark on the window." "Oh, I'm so sorry," said my mother. "No one deserves that. I did hear about your accident recently with your broken wrist and your bruised leg." "That was no accident," said Seraphine. "Silas pushed me down the stairs on purpose and called me a silly old bat. If you think of any derogatory name, I've been called them all. Believe me, I have." "That's appalling, dear. You should have reported him to the sheriff," said my mother. "Men like him want locking up." "If I had done that, his twin brother would have been around like a shot to finish me off, and I would have disappeared from the face of the earth and been buried somewhere in the woods over there, never to be seen or heard from again. Those two were as thick as thieves, and as insidiously duplicitous as each other. Silas was not a good man." "Did you kill him?" asked my mother. "In self-defence, of course. I mean, it's perfectly understandable if you did, and no one could judge you for that in the circumstances." "Oh, heavens, no. I didn't kill him. I couldn't have done that." "Well, then what happened, dear?" "Please, can I have another tot of brandy to calm my nerves? I keep shaking." "Of course, dear," said my mother, handing her another tot of brandy, which she drank down in one gulp. "I think I should tell you the whole story from the beginning," said Seraphine, "just so you understand exactly what happened, so you can wisely advise me on what to say to the sheriff." "Well, dear, I'm no expert on police matters, but I will do what I can to help," said my mother. "So tell me your story." "Well, Silas had been in a bad mood all day yesterday. Don't get me wrong, he's always grumpy. That's not unusual, but there are levels to his mood. And when he's very mad, he walks around kicking everything from the dog to the sides of the house. I call this his level A mood, and I do my level best to stay out of his way to avoid being beaten from an inch of my life. The dogs are nowhere to be seen when Silas is in a level A mood, as they're terrified of him, and they can sense when he's like this." "You poor thing," said my mother. "That's got to be an awful way for anybody to live, walking on eggshells all the time." "Anyway, I was cooking dinner for Silas that evening, and I was making him his very special meatloaf dish to appease him according to his favourite recipe, which he insists on my using a few pinches of cloves to spice up the dish. But I discovered that I'd run out of cloves, and so I cooked the meatloaf without the spice, and he took a couple of bites of it and threw the meatloaf at the wall in a complete rage, creating a chaotic mess over the kitchen. "There is no spice in this meatloaf," he screamed. "You've made a disaster. This food is disgusting. The meatloaf is insipid. It's bland. It's awful." In that moment he blew up like a volcano, spewing hot molten lava, and I knew by his enraged look he was about to throttle me like a rabid wild dog, as he began foaming at the mouth. So in terror I bolted out of the kitchen, while he pursued me with his hunting rifle, firing a few shots after me as I ran into the woods as fast as I could. My mother looked at Seraphine in astonishment. "You mean he fired at you with his hunting rifle? Am I getting that right? He literally fired at his own wife?" "Oh, yes, he did. And he wasn't playing games with me either. I sense he meant to kill me, and I ran into the woods screaming, I was so terrified. I kept praying, God, oh God, please help me. Don't let me die. Please help me. I could see he was standing only yards away from me, with his rifle in his hand, aiming it directly at me, and I knew then that I was dead. I was begging him not to shoot. I said, Silas, please, don't shoot, and he just laughed at me. He began to laugh at me. It was all a big joke to him. All of a sudden, something massive and Herculean in size came trumpeting through the trees like a huge, angry elephant in full charge. And it seized the rifle from my husband's hands and literally bent it in half and threw it into the bushes. This thing was growling furiously and fiercely like a very aggressive, dangerous lion, with his mouth curled backwards to expose his big, white, glistening teeth. He screamed at Silas in such a loud, loud noise that it caused the ground to completely shake. What was this thing? Asked my mother. It was a giant wild man, covered in long brown hair and incredibly large. He did have ape-like aspects to his appearance. I know it's hard to believe, but it's really true. Oh, I believe you, said my mother. My daughter and husband have both seen the wild man before. What did he do next? Well, my husband began to scream with terror as the wild man picked him up by the waist as if he was a tiny doll, and he began slamming him hard against the tree. And on the first blow I could see he was dead, but the wild man never stopped. He kept beating my husband's body until it broke apart like a china doll, and his flesh looked like blobs of jelly splattered everywhere. Oh, goodness, said my mother, that must have been a horrendous thing to watch. Well, I knew the wild man had definitely saved my life, so I was very grateful and thankful to him. I could tell he was very angry indeed with my husband's treatment of me, and when he glanced up at me, I noted he had kind, warm, congenial eyes. He seemed very concerned about my welfare. The wild man then just glided away into the woods and was gone from my sight. Wow, said my mother, the man's a hero. My point is, said Seraphim, what am I going to do? Well, said my mother, if I were in your shoes, I would report my husband missing after going hunting in the woods, and then the sheriff will send out a search party, and they'll find the bullet casings and stumble across your husband's body, and will assume he was attacked by a bear that tried to kill him. If you tell the sheriff about the wild man, you'll not sound credible at all, and even if he were to believe you, the last thing you want is to get that wild man into trouble, as he saved your life, so you are somewhat indebted to him. Well, that's my thinking too, said Seraphim. But what shall I do about my husband's brother? What if he comes after me? What if he tries to kill me? He won't blame you for his brother's death, especially after that police report that will confirm a bear attack. I mean, what would you have to do with that? But I think, to be safe, you should stay with us until the whole thing boils over. And so it was that Seraphim stayed with us for a few weeks, until the investigation was finally closed, as the coroner reported that Mr. Townsend had been ravaged by a bear. My mother went to the woods and left apple pies for the wild man, and they were eaten, as the containers were left at Seraphim's kitchen door, so I think he must have enjoyed them. Well, at least I hope he did. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Barry, and I was born and raised in Tennessee, which is the southern part of the United States and considered part of Appalachia. I grew up in a charming wooden cabin that had been made from mature timber beams and had been passed down to us through the generations on my father's side of the family, and it came with a sizable plot of pristine-looking land. The cabin was one of those indestructible, sturdy homes that could withstand a lot of wear and tear, and so it was ideal for us, growing up, given that we were rambunctious, hyperactive children that were rather predisposed to breaking almost everything we touched. Appalachia is an exquisitely beautiful part of the world, as anyone will ever tell you. And if you grow up here, you become so attached to the mountains, forests, lakes, and scenic vistas, so much so that they almost become an intrinsic part of you. Growing up, our property consisted of emerald green rolling hills, a pretty flowery prairie, a large silvery pond, and a sizable barn, all heavily flanked by a vast area of forest consisting of oaks, maples and dogwoods, which was a haven for indigenous wildlife from squirrels, foxes and raccoons, and was also accessible to the public with footpaths and large hiking trails. Needless to say, given the fact that this wood green was almost an extension of our own property, as kids we considered it as such, and it was our special place where we would play all kinds of games from cops and robbers to hide and seek. I grew up in the 50s, and it was a time when things were looking rather promising for Americans as the economy boomed under President Eisenhower. But the problem was that some people in our neck of the woods were still caught up in the poverty trap, and regretfully my family was one of those people, in the early years of the 50s, that is. Even though in many respects I had what I can only describe as an enviable, idyllic childhood, in its incipience life was hard for us as a family, and we struggled to get by financially, as money was always wanting and in short supply. Unfortunately, money was the one commodity that both my parents argued about day and night unfailingly. Their yelling voices were a prelude of a great distress for my brother and I in the early years. "I hate you," my mother would yell. "You have no idea how hard it is with 2 young kids to raise. And you have the brass neck to accuse me of being wasteful. How dare you? Do you know how expensive it is to feed those 2 boys of ours?" "But I see you brought yourself a brand new dress today," screamed my father. "You have enough clothes already, and you go wasting our money on frivolous, extravagant things like this that we can ill afford." "Frivolous," my mother would scream. "How dare you? When last did I buy myself something nice? Do you know how humiliating it is to go to church every single Sunday wearing exactly the same dress over and over again, and have the people look at you with piteous expressions on their faces? It's downright embarrassing, that's what it is. And pardon me for having a little pride." "Oh, so you're being humiliated for wearing the same dress again means that you're willing to go throwing my money to the wind." "You don't understand what it's like to be a woman," cried my mother. "You're right. I don't understand. You're willing to put pride over our family's needs. Now that is disgusting and exceedingly selfish." There were times my brother and I would put our hands over our ears and beg the unceasing arguing to just please stop. "I wish they'd shut up," I'd say to my brother. "I wish they'd stop droning on and on about money all the time. I really think they should realise how lucky we are to have each other. After all, isn't that what really counts?" "I'm not sure Mum understands that," said my brother. "It would seem that image is so much more important to her than what our family actually needs." "I think you're being unkind and judging Mum way too harshly," I said. "What's wrong for a woman to want a few nice things? I do get where she's actually coming from." One day my mother came into our bedroom and sat on our beds, reaching out for both of our hands to hold. I was dismayed to discern how red she appeared around the eyes, and also to discern that she had a long stream of tears pouring down her pink cheeks. It was not like her to look this sorrowful, downhearted and miserable. What was wrong, I wondered? Had something dreadful happened? "I have something terrible to tell you," she told us, "and I'm not sure I have the heart to tell you about it, but it seems that I must." "Are you getting a divorce?" I asked quickly. "Oh, nothing like that," she told us. "Why on earth would you think such an awful thing? Your father and I have our differences, granted, and occasional altercations, but we do love each other very much." "It doesn't seem like that," I said. "You're always quarrelling." My mother looked dumbfounded and appalled. "Is that what you kids really think? You believe your father and I are unhappy together?" "Yes, we do. Because you always fight," my brother exclaimed. "Oh dear," said my mother, looking at us earnestly. "I think your father and I should be ashamed of ourselves. I can see that we've caused a great deal of bother and dismay to the both of you, with our incessant arguing, which has got to stop. Do you realise how much I love and treasure you both? I don't think I tell you enough, and it's times like this when you realise how valuable and precious your loved ones really are. Tell me, boys, how would you like to have another brother?" "You're pregnant?" I asked, looking shocked. This was not what I wanted to hear. "Is that why you're upset? You don't want another kid because you won't be able to buy more dresses for yourself?" My mother looked visibly troubled and disquieted by my words. No,
No, to all your questions, my mother said, wiping her tears away with her hands and blowing her nose very hard. I have a very regretful, sad story to have to tell you. My sister and her husband were found dead this morning, as they were attacked and killed by a savage bear. Your cousin Marty is coming to live with us, and we are going to adopt him as our very own child. The good news is he's about your age, so you'll have another brother. How do you feel about that? Not good, I said honestly. If you fight about how expensive we are to raise, it's going to be 1,000 times worse when there are 3 of us. I think you'll find you're wrong about that, said my mother, kissing me tenderly on the cheek. If there is a rosy lining to this dreadful saga, my sister and her husband had a little money, and that's going to make a very big difference to transform our lives for the better, which means your father and I are going to be a lot less apprehensive about money. But more significantly of all, it really makes me realise what is important in life, and that is our beautiful family. And so it was that my cousin Marty came to live with us. I'd never really liked him very much, as he was a very quiet, withdrawn kid, and somewhat of a social misfit that kept himself to himself and never interacted with any of the other kids. The quintessential nerd, so to speak, that was not cool to be seen hanging around with at school. And now he was becoming my brother. Could things get any worse than that? I didn't think so. Needless to say, I wasn't looking forward to his unwelcome presence in our home, and I knew my brother felt exactly the same way as I did, only he was far too nice to express his misgivings, unlike me. Now, you're both to be very kind to your cousin Marty, my mother insisted. You must remember he's grieving a very tragic loss. You would do well to talk to him about what happened to his parents. The social worker told us that it will help him to heal a great deal, and it's much better for someone his own age to commiserate with him about the tragedy. What if I don't want to? I said to my mother. I don't even like Marty. Now, don't you go talking like that about Marty and dismissing him out of hand. It's wrong to judge your cousin so indiscriminately, with such bull-headed prejudice, without giving him a second chance. My parents were walking on eggshells, and I'm not kidding you about that, to appease him and make him feel welcome, loved and wanted. You could tell that they would move heaven and earth for him. They were terrified to upset him in any way. Are you all right, Marty? They would say. Is everything okay, Marty? Are you all right, Marty? It would seem like our house had become as airy as a morgue, as quiet as a church, and as dull and lifeless as a cemetery. For a moment I almost wished my parents would begin to fight and argue again, so that we could banish and abolish the drone-like monotony of the silence, and rekindle some kind of lively spark in our sombre, gloomy, depressed, dismal and colourless home. I told you that I'm not as nice as my brother, and that was proved one day when I'd had quite enough, and in my growing sense of frustration and infuriation, I actually punched Marty so very hard that he began to sob and sob like a baby. I couldn't restrain myself from punching him over and over again, till he sobbed more and more. I was so relieved to see that there was some kind of life in the seemingly soulless boy. My mother was absolutely furious with me and said, "What are you doing, you stupid boy? Can't you see? Marty's grieving. How can you be so insensitive and cruel?" It would seem that punching Marty was the best thing I could have ever done for him, because he cried and he cried until his tears had all dried up, and he could cry no more. After he'd been punched and pounded by me within an inch of his life, Marty began to talk. "I suppose you think I'm a big baby," he said. "Yes, I do," I told him. "I'm not going to lie to you to make you feel good about yourself, just because your parents are dead, just like everybody else does. Yes, I do feel sorry for you, but I'm not going to give you any special treatment." "I don't want you to," he said. "I'm sorry, though," I said in a moment of surprising compassion. "Of course I am that you've lost your parents to a bear attack. It must have been awful for you, and I mean that very sincerely. I am sorry." "It wasn't a bear that killed my parents," insisted Marty. "That's what the police say. I tried to tell them what it was, but they wouldn't listen. They just thought I was a silly little boy, so they refused to listen to anything I had to say." "Well, if it wasn't a bear," I said sarcastically, "what was it then? A bobcat? A mountain lion?"
"It was a wild man," said Marty. "He was built like a giant. He was the size of 5 or 6 men, and he was covered in long hair." "Don't be ridiculous," I scoffed. "Are you having a laugh? Because it's not funny, Marty." "Do I look like I'm laughing?" he said. "I think he's telling us the truth, Barry," said my brother. "Give him a break. Why don't you tell us your story, Marty?" he encouraged. "I'm not sure you would believe it if I did tell you," said Marty, sounding ominously like he was going to clam up. "Why don't you try us, Marty?" I said. "I'm all ears." This was the astonishing story that Marty told us. One day my father went hunting in the wood green near our home. I remember it was an exquisitely beautiful summer's day. There had been reports by the locals of a large bear seen loitering in the woods, so my father was eager to take it down. He really wanted the magnificent pelt, and he liked the idea of having the bear's head mounted upon our wall like a proud trophy. He regularly hunted in the area and was considered an excellent shot. So he ventured into the woods on his own, and when he left he was in a great mood because he was whistling happily to himself. He told us that on this particular occasion the woodgrove seemed to take on a very menacing ambience, becoming chillingly spooky and very sinister. He got the distinct impression that he was being scrutinized by very malicious, unseen eyes. He said his gut was telling him to leave now, but the very thought of acquiring the bear head outweighed his desire to listen to the inner warning voice within, telling him to quit while he was ahead. He really regretted not listening to that voice. That was when he saw a black bear stealthily walking through the brush, and he took aim and fired a couple of shots at the creature, and the bear unleashed the most terrifying, appalling, discomposing scream, and then flopped to the ground dead. My father said he'd never heard a bear cry out like that before, and it sent a chill down his spine. When he ambled over to the creature, he realized to his horror that he had killed a man, but a man that was wild and covered in hair, built like a massive giant. He said this thing was so gargantuan in size, easily over 8 foot tall, with a barrel-like torso, overlong arms, short powerful legs, and a very human face with a beard and moustache. From the back, my father had assumed that this was a bear. He said he felt a terrible sense of shame overcome him. He said it was like he had murdered someone in cold blood, because this thing, whatever it was, appeared remarkably human. He said he looked down at the body and began to profusely apologize to the corpse, saying how dreadfully sorry he was for what he'd done. He was incredibly distressed and troubled that he ran home to tell my mother what had transpired, and my mother begged him to show her the strange body, because the story sounded so incredulous, and she was eager to see what the wild man looked like for herself. My father eagerly took my mother to the woods, and the body of the wild man had completely disappeared, and my father could not fathom where it had got to. I mean, the man weighed over 700 pounds. Who could have lifted it? But someone or something had indeed done so. For a while the forest was filled with pretty birdsong, but that suddenly dissipated, and both my parents began to get the terrifying impression that they were not alone and were being watched. My mother told me that she'd never felt such a foreboding trepidation like that before. She described it as so chilling that her blood turned icy cold, so much so that there were goosebumps on her arm. She turned around to my father and said, "Something is not right about this place. We are being studied by menacing eyes. We need to get out of here, and fast." All of a sudden they heard the most dreadful roaring sound. My mother said it was worse than the sound of a lion, because the ground literally vibrated under its god-awful velocity, and it reverberated through her chest violently. My mother started to run for her life, but my father told her to slow down, because if she ran, the predator hiding in the brush would be more than likely to pursue her and hunt her down. As my parents retreated through the wood green, they heard something bipedal and big following them. My mother said you could hear heavy feet pressing down foliage and crunching down twigs, and when they stopped, so did the footsteps behind them. But when they moved ever forwards, so did the feet begin crunching the leaf litter again. They guessed at once it must be a wild man of some kind following them, like the one my father had killed, and they were so scared that the critter might want to extract its revenge on them,
especially if it knew my father had killed one of its kind. I remember my parents discussed everything vigilantly over dinner, and they told me to avoid visiting the woods because of what my father had done. They believed that they had been followed by another one of these wild men who might be trying to seek revenge on behalf of its fallen comrade. It was something my parents considered as a very distinct possibility, which was why we decided to go away for a couple of weeks for a brief holiday. It was to be the last holiday we ever had together as a family. Well, when we returned home, our house was a complete and total shambles. It was as if someone had torn down the front door violently, and all our things had been flung haphazardly all over the place. Even the filling in the sofas had been torn out and was scattered in pieces of cotton wool all over the floor. Our mattresses were also shredded apart, and drawers had been thrown all over the place, with clothes flung everywhere. It looked almost as if our house had been broken into by a drug squad in a police raid. "So you did call the police?" I asked. "Of course," said Marty, and even they admitted it looked like a police drug raid because something or someone was looking for something in our home, but they said it looked as if the front door had been broken down by a mighty force of some kind. "Did your parents think it was a wild man?" I asked. It did cross their mind, but it was the way that the things had been gone through that led them to believe that the break-in was of human origin. But now I'm not so sure about that. Anyway, after my parents returned home, things began to settle down to normal again, and we even fitted a brand new front door. About 2 days later, we awoke in the middle of the night to hear stones being flung at our home, and they were breaking windows and causing a substantial damage to the walls and the roof. That was when we saw a wild man through the window. It was a full moon that night, and the outside light was on, so we could see him very clearly. I've never seen anything look so furious or disgruntled in all my life. It was clear this anguished critter wanted blood, and it would not be happy until we were all dead, because my father had killed its friend, and it was seeking vengeance. That seemed clear. Perhaps it didn't understand it was a mistake, I suggested. Maybe if it had known you were aggrieved about what had happened and felt remorseful, it would have not been so reactive and affronted. Well, what could my parents do about it? It was not as if they could talk to the critter. It wouldn't even speak our language. So what did he do? I asked. Your father, I mean. Well, my dad became incensed with the critter, and my mother suggested he calm down immediately and call the sheriff before he did something foolish that he would later regret. My mother warned him wisely that he could not take the critter down on his own accord, because he was no match for this wild man. But my father was stubborn and obstinate, and refused to listen. On the contrary, I perceived my mother's words seemed to fire up my father, and he said, "You don't think I can take the wild man down myself? You want a bet?" He then stormed out of the house, looking as explosive and volatile as the critter himself, and he ran towards the critter intentionally and began to scream at it. "How dare you throw stones at my house? What do you think you're doing?" He was so mad, and he was firing warning shots into the air. In truth, he almost looked manic the way he was behaving. While my mother was watching this unfold, tears of regret were pouring down her face. "Your father is a complete idiot," she said. "What is he thinking?" She began to grab the phone to call the sheriff, but dropped the receiver when she saw the critter had grabbed my dad's gun, thrown it on the roof, and was now tossing my father in the air like a frisbee, where he landed on the concrete cement with a mighty smash. I promise you my dad looked like a fragile mannequin in the wild man's monstrous hands. My mother grabbed a frying pan from the kitchen. She had lost all her fear, and she began chasing the critter, screaming, "Leave my husband alone!" I think she knew in that moment that my dad was dead, and somehow she lost her fear because she was so enraged, and she ran boldly after the creature. The next thing I knew, my mother was being flung 10 foot into the air and went crashing to the cement floor like my father had done. They both lay on the ground dead. In seconds, I had lost both my parents. I remember racing out to my parents' bodies, and I began to sob uncontrollably as I clutched my mother's dead arm in my hand. The critter watched me. He didn't say a thing. He just observed me for a while, and then glided away. He didn't even attempt to attack me. "What did you tell the police?" I asked. Well, I started to tell the officer my story, but he didn't believe a word of it.
He said, "I've got to hand it to you, son. You have a wild imagination, and you can tell a very good story. But you and I know it was a bear that did this." He then said, "Son, a word of advice. Don't tell anyone what you've told me. They might think you've lost your marbles." "What a cheek," I said, finding myself feeling strangely protective towards Marty. "Even I knew you were telling the truth." "So do I," said my brother. "Thanks," said Marty, his eyes filling with tears. "That means a whole lot." From that moment on, I had a whole new respect for Marty, now that I understood what he'd been through, and I began to see him through brand new eyes, and before long I considered him like a brother to me. After Marty moved into our home, things did improve dramatically, as my parents made a conscious effort not to fight anymore, and it did help having more money. Life was definitely optimised for all of us. I also think that my mother, having inherited her sister's beautiful wardrobe of clothes and always looking so glamorous for church, really did feel more confident about herself. One day our teacher at school invited a Native American medicine man to speak to our class informally on traditional medicine and the power of plants and their healing benefits, and this man made a casual reference to the wild men of the woods. After he'd spoken to the class, I asked if I could speak to him during recess, and he had agreed. That was when I told him Marty's story and the terrible fate that became his parents. "This is a very sad story indeed," said the medicine man. "The Native Americans knew how to respect the wild man, but your culture has misunderstood him, and that is where the problems arise. They cause conflict and discord. You must perform a healing ceremony in the woods near your home, and you need to sit in a closed circle holding hands together, and I want you to burn some sage in the middle of this circle. We call this smudging, as it helps to remove the negative energy. You all need to close your eyes and call upon the great spirit of the wild man. You have to seek their forgiveness, or the bad energy will cloud Marty's life forever and never leave, and his life on this earth plane will be very short indeed. After the ceremony is complete, you need to leave a basket of fruit outside the forest as a gift. Our people always did this for the guardian of the forest, and this is a sign of great respect and honour." "How will we know if the great spirit of the wild man has forgiven him?" I asked the medicine man. "Oh, believe me, you will know." And so it was that Marty, my brother, and I sat together in a circle, holding hands and smudging the circle with the sage to clear away the negative energy. We closed our eyes and called upon the spirit of the wild man, and we quietly confessed our apologies and asked for forgiveness. "I felt something," Marty told me after the ceremony. "It was like a peace came over me, and a heaviness was lifted." The following night we all went to sleep, and all three of us compared notes, and it came to light that we'd all had exactly the same dream. We dreamed that an eagle had perched upon our hands and pecked out a feather from its wing and flown off, leaving us with a single feather. It seemed nonsensical that we all had the identical dream, but things became weirder still when my mother entered our bedroom holding up 3 eagle feathers in her hands. I mean, how is that even possible? Could dreams have real-life consequences in our lives, I wondered. It would seem they have more power than we could ever imagine. "You will never believe what happened this morning," my mother said. "I opened the front door, and there were 3 eagle feathers lying on the doorstep. And if that wasn't odd enough, there was also a bald eagle soaring above our cabin. I couldn't believe it," she said. "It was such a spiritual experience. I felt as if I was connecting with that eagle somehow." "I think the feathers are for us," I told my mother. "How funny," she said. "That's exactly what I assumed." She handed them to me. "Isn't that odd?" she said, walking away. I handed my brother their feathers, and we agreed that this was a sign that we had been forgiven. And I still have my feather today, and it means the world to me. And as for Bigfoot, my impressions of him are only of the good kind. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.